episode of The Ownership Economy, we speak with Staci Warden, the CEO of the Algorand Foundation. Staci previously ran the Center for Financial Markets at the Milken Institute, and before that worked as an executive at JPMorgan and Nasdaq. She started her career as a development economist at the United States Department of the Treasury. In the episode, we discuss how Algorand works, its unique value proposition, and some real-world applications of this blockchain. We hope you enjoy the episode. Staci, thanks for joining us.
I'm so happy to be here.
So we like to start these out by hearing a little bit about your background, your origin story. Tell us kind of, how your career began and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I had the opportunity to work with a famous development economist named Jeffrey Sachs when I was in my 20s. And I worked for him for 7 years. And he was sort of the author of the Breaking the Back of Hyperinflation in Latin America in the 80s. And then he was the guy behind something called shock therapy, which was a way to get the communist transition economies into a more free market way of thinking. And this is Poland, former Soviet Union. So it was a kind of a heady time to be involved in those things as a young person. And I fell in love with development economics as a result. And then my career kind of progressed away from that. He's a professor at Harvard, and I went to grad school at Harvard and all that kind of thing. So that was a little bit sort of my 20s. But then I went to, and I've done now stints in the public sector. I worked for the U.S. Treasury Department. In the private sector, I was with JPMorgan for 8 years. I was with the Nasdaq for a couple of years. I worked for Mike Milken at a think tank at a nonprofit for about 8 years as well. And they've all been, my parents didn't believe this always at the time, but they've all been kind of connected in some way. And it's been around, access to capital, this idea that well-functioning capital markets can be a very important engine for growth in an economy. And it's been about kind of financial inclusion in various different guises, I would say, from the sovereign level down to the household level. This has been sort of a theme that's carried through my career, I would say.
Very interesting. I don't want to derail this, but it'd be interesting at some point, maybe on a future podcast, to go into whether or not shock therapy actually works, or if we're dealing with the repercussions of it today. But
I think it's probably a mixed bag for sure.
So you mentioned that you worked in the public sector. You started out early in your career at Treasury, where there's this kind of interesting program that is almost a precursor to the regenerative finance community or kind of climate tech community that is now kind of intersecting with the crypto community. Specifically, this U.S. Tropical Forest Conservation Act, which essentially is a debt for nature swap, which when I was reading about kind of the background on your career, I found very interesting because I hadn't heard a lot about these programs. Then when I dug into it, was pretty surprised how much money is actually being forgiven from a debt perspective. So maybe you could just walk us through this mechanism, because I thought, given how much we focus on regenerative finance on this podcast, it might be interesting for the listeners.
Yeah, 100%. When I was at the turn of the century, I guess it's funny to say that, but turn of the century when I was at Treasury, and it was a very heady time to be in international finance. It was during something called Jubilee 2000, which was it led by the UK, actually, a broad-based effort to relieve the debt of developing. It was a developing country debt forgiveness program. And in the United States, it was called the Highly Indebted Poor Countries, the HIPC initiative, where we would, in various guises, they would put together poverty reduction strategies, and we would forgive in concert. So the G7 countries would forgive debt in concert to these countries. And one piece of that wasn't, it wasn't exactly related, but it was kind of caught up in all of that, was something called the Tropical Forest Conservation Act. And this was a small pot of money. It was about $40 million that was actually kind of owned by the Treasury Department. And so they liked this program in part for that reason. But what we would do is we would agree to give a debt relief to a developing country if they would use the money that we gave in debt relief to do various things that would protect their tropical forest. And so it was a joint initiative with the State Department and the Treasury Department. So the State Department was more on the monitoring of, what they were actually doing on the ground. And we were and so the State Department sort of owned the program once I launched it, once the Treasury Department kind of launched it. But we would have these countries and they would apply and they would have proposals together about how they were going to protect their rainforest. Our debt was kind of scored internally. And the interesting thing about that actually was that the less likely they were to repay the debt, the lower the score and the more and the cheaper the relief you could give, right? So there was a funny sort of almost misplaced incentives in a way that you had to be, quite careful about when you were doing it. But it was a nice program for sure. And we would partner with some of the big, the Nature Conservancy and the like to do this.
Interesting. I kind of think of, how much has that kind of mechanism caught on? And have you seen kind of growth in that over the past 20 years, or has it been kind of out of favor? It seems like something with COP and just ending that, would be, a mechanism that more and more countries, at least in the West, would be interested in.
Yeah, I think it absolutely has. And it's a version of a social impact bond in a certain way, right? Where an NGO will sometimes undertake the obligation of sort of helping these countries do these things and executing on the thing. And so I think it's fair to say that it definitely was a precursor to all kinds of financial innovation along these lines. And it's gotten more, more complicated, maybe more sophisticated is a better word since then. But yeah, absolutely. I would say it was an important early mover and just trying to come up with creative ways to, come up with a bit of a win-win.
Yeah. I spent a few years in the Dominican Republic, and it was just so blatantly clear that the kind of long-term impacts of debt on the Haitian side versus on the Dominican side, the debt to France, and kind of like the importance of figuring out kind of interesting mechanisms like this. So then you spent 8 years at Milken, and then in and of itself must have been a very interesting time on being able to kind of meet, leaders and influencers from around the world. But how did you get into crypto? Like, what was the journey to Algorand?
So I have, I think, kind of a unique story because I was doing, and this was when I had finished with the Nasdaq and JPMorgan, and I was at the Milken Institute, and I was running the Center for Financial Markets. So it was an economic policy, financial markets policy shop in DC. And I had a joint initiative with the National Institute for the Press to try to bring to the press topical financial markets issues of the day and to kind of just explain to them what was going on, just really like so make them smarter about the issues as opposed to trying to, give a view necessarily or, to lobby them per se, but just to kind of try to some of this stuff is complicated. And so I was trying to explain it. So it was actually a request from the National Institute for the Press saying, hey, we've got a lot of requests, like what is this Bitcoin thing? And part of my strategy was to so if we were talking about like GSE reform, for example, the reform of Fannie and Freddie after the housing crisis, I would bring somebody that worked on that all the time. And I would do some intro remarks and maybe do an interview or whatever. But I looked around and I'm like, I don't know anybody that knows anything about Bitcoin. This is in 2013. So I guess and I was curious. And so I better learn about it myself. And my house was being renovated, like deep renovation. And so I was living in this one bedroom and I just kind of locked myself in this one bedroom. I can picture it so clearly. And I was just, ordering pizzas and listening to these podcasts and just trying to figure out. And I wanted to figure out, like, how does this proof of work mechanism actually work, right? And what is this and why is it? And I, well and truly fell in love, I will say, and I started realizing this is a kind of thing that was an answer. It was not exactly an answer and it was a little early and it's not exactly fit for purpose, but Bitcoin, I saw it was an evolution of the other things that I was working on at the Milken Institute in terms of, when I was at the Milken Institute, it was very much, I was working on the importance of capital markets vis-a-vis the banking system. And it's very important in developing countries that you can get capital markets going because sometimes, especially in smaller countries, like five guys, the heads of the five banks make all the credit allocation decisions in the country, right? And, it's the old joke that you give, it's like the 3-6-4 joke. I think, you pay 3% on deposits, you get 6% buying government bonds, and you hit the golf course by 4 p.m., right? And banking in developing countries is very profitable. And this is a little bit of a tangent, but my working model for prosperity in the country and economic growth is that if household savers have good outlets for their savings, meaning that they can, give those savings to entrepreneurs in efficient ways, moderated, of course, through capital markets, those entrepreneurs then take those savings and they put them to productive uses and they grow and they hire more people and they pay the people better. And then the households have more savings. And this is the virtuous cycle that brings growth. It's very much a private sector led model of growth for me. So I was already thinking about capital markets issues and trying to think about how they could be more inclusive and get access to capital for small business and medium-sized businesses as well. And then crypto just seemed to me, and it does still seem to me, as a natural extension of that.
But you went from these kind of very hierarchical structures, right? The US government and JPMorgan and Nasdaq, and to a certain extent, I mean, maybe not as much Milken, to Algorand that prides itself on decentralization. And so why Algorand?
So as I said, in 2013, I got interested in crypto, and just funny things started happening, like that made me realize there's a there. I wrote an article, a long form article, like 4,000 word article about how Bitcoin works and what the proof of work looked like. And this article was down, to everybody's surprise, was downloaded like a lot at the Milken Institute. And then you're always fighting for the best room at the Milken Institute Global Conference. And I didn't get the best room. And like, what is this Bitcoin thing? But it was the most downloaded panel that year in 2014, I think it was. So, and then it just kept getting, more and more that I would dip into it. But I was running these other programs. And then by last year, by DeFi summer, I said, I can't do it anymore on a part-time basis. This is really, you have to kind of pick and I had also been at the Milken Institute for 8 years at that point. So I decided to leave, and I just was going to kind of, see what I wanted to do, but I wanted to do something in crypto. And then I was headhunted for the board of the Algorand Foundation. And so I joined the board, and then I was on the board for 3 or 4 months, and then they appointed me as the CEO in January of this year. But I will say that when you join a board, as you know, you are lending your name and your reputation, and you also have to imagine that you can be helpful to this organization, or else why would you join? And so I did a fair amount of due diligence on Algorand, on the protocol, before I joined the board. And I had, for the first time since that, 8 years that I was following the space, the first time that I had that same feeling that I had when I first came across Bitcoin, that, oh, I get it. This is really the real deal. This is really the thing. And so, proud to be here.
So again, I don't want to switch gears too much here, but you just kind of a note that I think is really interesting, which is I imagine you've sat on other boards, right? Both for-profit and nonprofit.
I sit on the board of the Global Blockchain Business Council. I sit on the board of the advisory board of the UN Capital Development Agency. So I have some other, nonprofit boards as well.
So you're just doing nothing over there. You're just kind of hanging out.
I have resigned from a couple, one that I really enjoyed actually, but there's many hours in the day, right?
But I think like
all right, sorry. I just wanted to say, good to know. I'll say hi to Sandra when I'm in Davos next month for
okay, fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Yep, she's an amazing woman. I'm very proud to sit on her board. And I'm glad you'll be there with her.
So I think the thing that's interesting about kind of sitting on the board, and be interesting to get your perspective, is that in a for-profit board, you've got fiduciary responsibility. And a nonprofit board, you're essentially, you can't do anything, right? I mean, it's just very, very hard to get anything done. I think most nonprofit board members wouldn't say that about the boards that they sit on, but in reality, you're dealing with a situation that just doesn't have the same sort of agency that you have in a private sector company. And it feels like Algorand has a bit of both of that, right? And so what was different about sitting on the board of a organization that is managing, a treasury that isn't being managed in kind of the same way as a traditional nonprofit, doesn't have the same sort of fiduciary responsibility as a for-profit? Like, what were some of the things that surprised you?
Well, one thing that was nice about being on the Algorand Foundation board is that typically on nonprofit boards, part of your role is also to fundraise. So, the first thing I noticed was that nobody was making me fundraise. That was pretty nice. But you're right. We do, we have a fiduciary responsibility to the community. And, maybe it's not exactly defined in the same way, but the Algorand Foundation, the money the algos that it holds on behalf of the community. And so it needs to act responsibly with that money on behalf of the community. They are shareholders, right? And so you take that very seriously at the foundation and as board members as well. And as you know, one of the great things about crypto is that it's a very transparent kind of place, right? So you publish transparency reports about what you're up to. Everything on the blockchain, as you know, by its nature is transparent. And so you have that duty, and you are, of course, reminded of that duty by the community.
Interesting. So walk us through Algorand and what's different about Algorand for people on the podcast that don't have a lot of exposure to it.
So Silvio Macaulay is the founder and inventor of Algorand. He is a famous cryptographer. He is a tenured professor at MIT, 20 years. He won the Turing Award, which is like the Nobel Prize in computer science, for a couple of things that the crypto ecosystem has used, and in particular, verifiable random functions and zero knowledge proof. These are his inventions or co-inventions, and they are used kind of throughout the ecosystem. And he did not have the idea, though, to attach money. It was really, he was a cryptographer. And Satoshi Nakamoto had the idea to attach cryptography to money. I think that was one of the important ways in which he was forefront leader of the space. But Silvio was watching this space develop, I think, and he thought to himself, I could probably build a better one of those. And so he was immediately able to raise, when he sort of had this notion, and he was able to raise some money, and he went live in 2019 with a crackerjack team of cryptographers, computer scientists, engineers, systems architects, that kind of thing. And the juice in a blockchain is really all about the consensus mechanism. And what he came up with was a very clever, lightweight, efficient, and scalable consensus mechanism, decentralized. And that's what sets Algorand apart. And that is there's a lot of things that differentiate blockchains, but that's the primary thing that differentiates one blockchain from the other is the consensus mechanism, which I can, of course, describe to you, but let me stop there for a minute.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. Describe it to us like we're five.
Okay. So here's the thing for anybody listening. I think you have a very sophisticated and well-versed audience, but for anybody that is listening to this to kind of learn like, what the heck is this? Here's the thing about the blockchain and crypto. Here's I would argue, the one sentence value proposition that makes it so important. It is the idea that you are writing to one ledger. So the history of innovation in banking has been that bank balance sheets talk to each other in a better way. Messaging from one bank balance sheet to another bank balance sheet gets faster, more reliable, more efficient, et cetera. That's kind of what banking innovation has been. Blockchain is fundamentally different than that. It is that everybody writes to the same ledger, all transactions. And so imagine the efficiency of that, right? I say that I'm going to pay you, Martin, and immediately you can see on the ledger that you've been paid and my account's been debited and your account's been credited. And of course, there's nuance to that, but that's basically what's going on. Now, if you want to operate with that system, there's a couple of very important things. One, it's very important that nobody controls that ledger, that not one entity doesn't control that ledger. And so different blockchains have different mechanisms whereby all of the computers that hold the ledger, they talk to each other, they agree on the order of transactions of the ledger. And even if some of those computers are evil, the rest of them can override those evil computers and come to an agreement about the ledger and protect the ledger. And if one computer is attacked, the ledger sits on all of the other computers at the same time. And so the blockchain is protected in that way. And so the benefits of a blockchain-based system, it's a little bit more cumbersome and unwieldy and expensive to have it like this versus a one centralized database. But there's a lot of security advantages to not having one database that can be hacked and attacked. And that one actor could, change the order of, transactions or do nefarious things to the ledger, right? This does not happen on a blockchain. So that is really for any 5-year-old that you run across, that is the one thing that you want them to understand about crypto is that you're all writing to one thing, and that's where the efficiency comes from. So somebody can send, it doesn't matter where you are. You could be in Nigeria or Singapore, and it's the same ledger, and immediately it is recorded and transferred because it's not actually really moving at all, right? It's just an entry. So Vitalik Buterin, who, after Satoshi Nakamoto, is probably the second most important person in crypto, and he invented the Ethereum blockchain. He posed this kind of famous challenge, which was to say that a blockchain cannot be decentralized and secure and scalable at the same time. And it kind of makes sense. And you probably know the trilemma of international monetary policy. If you want to do one thing, you have to give up one, or if you want to, you can do two, but not all three of these things. And it makes sense. The more decentralized you are.
You brought that up. So maybe just tell us what the trilemma of monetary policy is so that people don't have to go look it up.
Yeah, you can't have a fixed exchange rate, an independent monetary policy, and free-flowing capital flows. So, if you have, and one of those things has to give. And if either one of you could figure out a way, the way Silvio has to cut through that trilemma, then you will be famous and you will win Nobel Prizes and be very rich, let's say. But Silvio said, I think I could probably come up with a blockchain model that can be both scalable and decentralized and secure at the same time. And so that is the basis. And he calls that a pure proof of stake consensus mechanism. And if you'll allow me, 1 minute, the evolution of these consensus mechanisms is that Bitcoin had a proof of work consensus mechanism. And that means that the computers, I'm obviously simplifying, but they compete to solve a problem. And whoever solves the problem first is paid in Bitcoin. And that problem that they solve enables them to append the next block to the blockchain. And the trick with this is that the problem has to be hard to solve, but easy to verify. So it takes a lot of work to solve it. And then everybody else can check it with minimal effort. And then they check it and they agree, and the block is appended to the blockchain. Then there's some problems with that, though, one of which, the most famous of which, is that it inherently uses a lot of energy, because inherently it's an arms race. You have to work harder and harder to be faster and faster. And, you end up spending more and more on specially designed chips and all of that kind of thing just to solve this problem. You get paid for it. And so people came along and they said, also, whoever wins is not really maybe the most vested entity in the blockchain. So what we should reward those that are willing to, put a stake in the ground and be committed to the blockchain. And there's many versions of this, but let's just call it broadly a proof of stake consensus mechanism. So those that have the more stake, it seems like they should be the ones that get, the coin. And this is environmentally friendly approach, but it has a couple of problems. One of which is that the rich get richer. So it's inherently kind of like that. The bigger your stake, the more you're. And also the vector of attack is pretty clear. It's like attack that guy with the big stake. So it's not inherently very secure. Silvio came up with a consensus mechanism called pure proof of stake, based on this thing that he invented called verifiable random function. And what it is that for every algo, and it happens in 3 stages over a period of now 3.7 seconds. So every 3.7 seconds, another block is appended and it is final. Unlike in other blockchains, it is final after the block is appended. And I can go into how that model is different than other models. But just for now, the fact that you hold an algo means that you run what is called a verifiable random function on every algo runs its own little function. And I like to think of this as like a little slot machine. So you're all running a little slot machine. If like 3 pineapples come up, you are, out of all of the computers, and they're called nodes. Out of all of the nodes, a certain fixed number of them are selected. And then another process of those that are selected, these have the lowest hash function, and this one's picked, and it appends the next block. And then in the third round, it makes sure that there's nothing wrong with the transactions within the block. There's no double spending. There's no kind of nonsense within the actual transaction. So all of these algos, they scoop up the transactions and they try to get this. They try to have this random function. They are randomly perhaps. And so what this gives you is, first of all, it's very secure because nobody knows if they're going to be picked or not. Not even I, even if I win, I will not know until I have won that I won. And then second of all, it is both scalable and decentralized because you're picking from many, many algos across many, many nodes. So it's decentralized, but only a certain number of picks. So it's not that every node has to participate. So you get the kind of speed and agility at the same time. And then they agree through a protocol called the Byzantine Agreement, which basically means that the majority agree that, yeah, it's good. And then 3.7 seconds later, with finality, you have appended another block to the blockchain. Other blockchains don't work that way. What they do is you like on Bitcoin, for example, you append a block, but it may be that I tried to double spend my money. I had $10 in my account and I tried to give both of you $10 at the same time. And one of the nodes picked up the $10 that I sent to Martin and the other node picked up the $10 that I sent to Jad. And so now only one of those can exist and the blocks kind of perpetuate for a little while and then one falls off. And then the blockchain with it, which has the version that has the most work is the one that survives. And in Bitcoin, they say for certainty, 6 more blocks need to go by and they're 10-minute blocks. So basically an hour before you're absolutely sure. With Algorand, though, you run this Byzantine consensus agreement, this Byzantine agreement. And after the 3.7 seconds, you are sure, everybody is sure.
Cool. So what do you think are the biggest use cases for Algorand?
I think there's a couple of things about us that are pretty unique that maybe lend itself to use cases that maybe other blockchains won't as easily have. One of which is scale. So we are built for scale. We can do we went from 1,200 this year to now we do 6,000 transactions per second. So Visa does 7,000 transactions per second. They can get, at a peak load to something like 30, 35,000 transactions per second. But, we can now we have the capacity basically of Visa. So we can scale to these kind of, the cool kids call it TradFi, traditional finance, TradFi kind of things. Second of all, we have sub-penny pricing. So it's very, very cheap. So you can use us for small denominated amounts, right? So NFTs that don't cost, you've seen some of the problems with, Ethereum, where you're paying more in gas fees really than you did for the NFT that you wanted to buy kind of thing. So for these micro payments, financial inclusion, these kinds of things that can be very small amounts of money, you need to be on a blockchain it's not going to charge you a lot to do that. So these are the kinds of things. And I mean, I've got a number of kind of cool examples of things that, people are building on Algorand, but I think many attributes are common to many blockchains. But I think these are two of the ways in which we see a niche for ourselves. And of course, we're green, right? So, and we've been green, very kind of famously green from the beginning. We use the energy of like a small neighborhood, and we buy carbon offsets to make sure that we always stay carbon negative. And so entities that care a lot about that have tended to find us, I would say.
Okay. One application that you mentioned in a kind of a podcast you had, I forget which it was on escrow payments and how Algorand could be used for escrow payments. And that caught my attention a little bit because Jad and I just made an investment into a seed stage company that's focused on escrow payments for crypto. And so can you talk a little bit about that particular application? I don't think there was anyone doing it on Algorand yet, but it was something that you talked about, and it's proven to be pretty hard for other blockchains to tackle.
Investment to Algorand? Will you be moving your investment to Algorand?
They're in the process of trying to figure out, I will talk with them. Yeah. And I think they're trying to, applying to a couple of incubators right now as part of this round. And so we should touch with them. It's an exciting venture. So
plus, there's also no reason why it shouldn't be cross-chain. It should be everywhere. People should have the ability to choose the greenness of Algorand or some other advantage if they're going to Cosmos or Ethereum, what have you. So we should absolutely push them to Algorand.
Yeah. I mean, and we believe in a multi-chain world, and we actually think it'll be good for us because in a purely multi-chain world, and we have rolled out this year something called state proofs, which I can go into if you want. It's a little technical, that will make bridges much safer. Okay. So, but we think a purely multi-chain will be good for us because why wouldn't you settle on Algorand? It happens in 3.7 seconds without any forking and very cheaply. So we think we're going to get a pretty decent, migration of liquidity and activity if we're ever in that state of pure multi-chain world. So bridges have been, and if Terra Luna didn't happen and FTX didn't happen, the big scandal of crypto this year would have been the hacks of bridges. So this has been happening kind of all year long, hundreds of millions of dollars. And what happens in a bridge is that you need to, if you have two chains and you are going to move tokens from one chain to the other, you need to burn them on chain A to say, look, they can't be used over here, and then mint them again on the second chain. And a bridge has a consensus mechanism that sort of looks at that and says, yeah, they did mint that over here. They're not double spending, and they are now we can release them over here. And that instant where they are deciding to move them is a potential security risk, right? And so, geniuses over at the Algorand protocol, they eliminated, you always need a bridge for sort of liquidity and UI purposes and whatnot, but they developed something called state proofs, which uses the Algorand consensus mechanism itself. And it takes a picture of the blockchain. And so then by smart contract, you can port over the state of affairs of the blockchain without having to have these 27 entities in the middle coming to their own consensus. They don't have to stake, and you don't have to worry about them absconding with your, coins. So it's something that can be ported in a very lightweight way. And so we rolled that out this year to great fanfare, and we hope that it will be deployed around the crypto ecosystem. It's completely open source. We have no pride of ownership to it. And so that will, this is a bit of our contribution to helping us move to a safer multi-chain world. Yeah.
Cool. You talked a little bit about FTX and Luna, and it seems like the other kind of dirty secret of the scandals this year is that they were mostly around centralization, right? You had centralized actors that screwed up, but at the same time, as someone that's come from kind of a hierarchical world, I'm interested to understand how decentralization is working within Algorand, and what's the difference from kind of at the protocol layer? You've talked a little bit about how the organization is decentralizing, but like just in terms of operations, it seems like, we talk with a lot of people that come from DAOs on the show. And one of the things that comes clear is that it's actually very hard to decentralize operations at an early stage. And I'm just wondering, like, having come from a bit more of traditional firms and from working in government, like, how has the experience gone?
Yeah, well, let me, first of all, compliment you on I think you really honed in on the issue with what's happened this year. And let me just say a couple of sentences by way of sort of elaborating on that a bit, is that, if you have a regulated entity, well, you don't have insight, like, Credit Suisse has been, for example, in the news all year long. We don't have a good insight into Credit Suisse, but it is a regulated entity, and we trust the regulators and we trust the process that Credit Suisse goes through, right? In a DeFi construct, first of all, the code is typically open source, right? Then there's the blockchain so that you can see things. And then the way that it works is through two things. One is smart contract and two is over collateralization. So the combination of smart contracts, meaning a machine executes, you don't have to trust a human being to do what it told you it was going to do. And you always have to provide more collateral than you are borrowing. That combination has meant that throughout all of this shenanigans, starting with, Terra Luna and the rolling kind of through FTX, pure DeFi has performed as advertised. They have gone through this unscathed. Smart contracts, collateral started to go into free fall, smart contracts executed, lenders were made whole. No questions asked. No, can I have a few days to call my broker? No, I need a little more time to sort myself. No, I've been a good client for 5 years. No, executed and lenders made whole. Where we get into trouble is this we call CFI, centralized finance, this crypto adjacent, which is neither regulated nor is it run by, code is law kind of stuff, right? And this is where all of the trouble happened. And I think the irony of all of this is that pure crypto came out pretty well in this, but it's this kind of middle ground where you're neither one nor the other that I think where investors are getting hurt, right? And so when you think about decentralization, you think about it, I think, most importantly at the protocol level, but you also think about your community, right? And where decision-making power resides, right? And it's tricky and you have to move. And we especially, we don't like to make mistakes. So, we don't roll things out as quickly as maybe some other protocols but we've never gone down for 1 second and we are very careful, we're a careful blockchain, I would say. So, but we are also now embarking. We started when I came, not to suggest that this was my idea. It was already in process, but it rolled out in the first quarter of last year, a process whereby we start to devolve decision-making to the community. Now, a very interesting thing also with Algorand, which kind of sets the framework a little bit for this as well, is that the way that you can participate in consensus on the Algorand blockchain is very lightweight. You can do it with a high-performing laptop. It used to be a Raspberry Pi you could use, but now with these like upgrades to 6,000 transactions per second, et cetera, so you need a nice laptop. But because it's such a little ask, you are not paid to participate in consensus. We are unique in this. And so part of the way that the foundation also engages the community is by having the community make governance decisions about the protocol. So it's even more important in a way for us than it might be we're maybe a little bit more committed to it than other protocols might be. So last year, I would say we went through a series of votes to establish the structures under which the community would participate in things. And this coming year, we take, I think, a pretty big step forward, actually, to giving spending decisions and other kinds of decisions to the community. In particular, we will be rolling out our grants program, and we will take as a foundation a hands-off approach to giving off grants. So we will organize the way in which, through DAO structures, the community will be able to make their choices known about who should get grant money from the foundation. And that will be, that's kind of our next step on that. But you're right. Like, it's hard to, envision some kinds of things like, we have DevRel. I've got, I think, 12 people or 10 people in developer relations. So helping coders answer questions and, helping who's going to, where the dev, you need DevRel. You know what I mean? So it's like, we don't think that much about it because we're still on the path where there's lots of things that we can still be giving to the community. But you're right. I think the further along you go, the harder, the questions are going to be, a little bit more, we're going to have to be thoughtful. Like already we have committees now, DeFi committee, Web3 committee. We're just rolling out a governance committee, all of these, because it's just more and more to bring the community involved in decision-making.
Yeah. So I want to kind of touch on the centralization aspect, but Jad, maybe you could kind of jump in there. I know, you've spent so much time in DAOs, and so I'm interested to have you kind of talk through this a little bit as well.
Yeah, definitely. I think you're seeing this a lot across the ecosystem. So I like to joke about, when I'm at conferences or what have you, especially if you're not familiar with the Cosmos ecosystem, someone will be like, oh yeah, I'd love to build, I'd love to connect with their leadership team. And I'm like, there isn't one. There's no one to talk to, right? And that I don't necessarily think that's good or bad. It just is an approach to an ecosystem. So I'd love to learn a bit more about, you mentioned there's going to be DAOs for this type of stuff. How is Algorand thinking about this? Because I think you have so much to learn from in terms of mistakes that have been made in the last 24 to 36 months, roughly, where people have been like, oh, it's a bull market. We can just give, so-and-so person a multi-sig and we can fund it and we can just let them do stuff without really tying it back to things like DevRel metrics, developer adoption, and stuff like that. So I'd love to hear what you're thinking about, what the Algorand Foundation and all the entities involved in that ecosystem are thinking about. Where do you make new fruitful mistakes with stuff like this?
Yeah, I think you're right. There's definitely going to be some second mover advantages there for sure. And right now we're trying to understand, and I saw you do the interview, you did a podcast with Cosmos just recently, right? And yeah, I guess I agree. We need to really understand what to not do and what to do. And like I say, we try to move deliberately on these things. So, we'll do this in the same way.
Do you feel like from a philosophical perspective, I really believe in decentralization. I believe in broad-based ownership, I believe in kind of the ideals of the social solidarity economy. But at the same time, on a day-to-day basis, when I read some of this stuff around how much to actually decentralize, how these DAOs actually work, it goes against everything I've learned in business in terms of decision-making, in terms of, I think one of the most, so I'm just kind of interested, do you feel those kind of the pull of kind of the traditional model on a day-to-day basis and when trying to lead in this position? Or have you gotten used to kind of a more consensus-based leadership, given that you transitioned out of the bank into more of a nonprofit organization?
I think the California referendum governance model is probably not the best working model that one could have for governance, right? I don't live in the state, but sometimes I watch it and I think, right, they're not making policy in, as good a way as they could, right? But, like I say, I've been in this space for a while and I knew what I was signing up for. And I think sometimes our community, when things are not going well, they can be even mean, frankly, and I think they hold me personally accountable in a way that is much more immediate than it would be in a kind of a traditional, if I was the CEO of a traditional company, they have something to say and there's a very close interaction, but mostly you get just a lot of energy and a lot of juice from that, that how much people care and how engaged they are on a day-to-day basis and how much work they're willing to do in support of this community and support of this protocol. And, net, I think it's positive, but you're right. You have to, you want the right decisions to be made, but you also have to always acknowledge that you might not know what the right decision is, right? And there is something to be said for sure for the wisdom of the crowd, right? That somehow the majority is probably going to find its way to the right answer. But there's all kinds of, technical questions around that, who's going to do the work? How are they going to be incented to do the work? Right now, the work is at all levels not particularly onerous. The more decentralized it gets, that workload is going to get more onerous. How do we make sure that it's done and done carefully and all of, it can make your head hurt, thinking about it. But, it's the path we're on. We're committed to the path, but you're right to indicate to me some maybe not fully paved roads ahead, right? You have me back on next year and I'll give you an update.
Yeah, I kind of look at, I don't really hate anything, but, if I could hate something, I would hate Mark Zuckerberg and everything he's done over the past 13 years to society. But I do think that to a certain extent, if he turns around Facebook, you need a kind of a centralized leadership structure and you need a command and control structure, right? And so I don't think that I don't think any institutional investor would allow him to make this pivot to lose $10 billion a year if he wasn't completely in control. I don't know if he will make the pivot. I don't know if the pivot will be good for society. But I also think that there is something about decisive leadership. And I wonder, when you're in crisis, how much that can be solved through community. And I think that's going to get tested over kind of the coming years. And I'd like to think that the wisdom of the crowd works in those situations, but I also think crowds during crisis can be, brutal.
And role-based policymaking as well. I gave this example of kind of DeFi and contracts executing automatically, but I did also see this when I looked after the public sector practice at JPMorgan during the global financial crisis. And central banks had rules, and large corporates did as well, but they weren't my clients. I'll just speak from what I saw firsthand. They had rules about when they needed to sell. If an investment grade bond went to non-investment grade bond, then they needed to sell. And they were inadvertently, in many cases, making the situation worse because they had to respond to a rule-based investment framework when good judgment would have, and if they were allowed to make that judgment, they would have been able to ride it through a little bit and done potentially less damage to their own balance sheet and maybe to also the environment, right? So you have to be, remember when Mark Zuckerberg had this notion and, shoved this down the investors' throats, there was plenty of voices at the time that said, investors are so short term, they manage to quarterly earnings. And then finally, now the entrepreneur is going to have the freedom to make longer term decisions for the basis of for the good of the company and not have to be to this like short termism, So either model can get you in trouble, of course, right?
Yeah. I also worry about kind of the structure that Zuckerberg or more probably Google are under in terms of to the extent that they reach generalizable AI first, right? And then you have this kind of very, very centralized structure in place with, generative AI that's self-perpetuating. So anyways, in kind of these last 10 or 15 minutes, it'd be great to kind of hear a little bit about the applications of Algorand to make this tangible for people. And you have some pretty cool projects in place. One is this IP project that's happening in Nigeria. Can you talk a little bit about Koi Banks and what they set up with Nigeria?
I thought you would never ask. As a matter of fact, I just happen to have a few in my head that I might be able to talk about. So the Nigeria platform, they have not gone live yet, but my understanding is that they're going live pretty soon, is a platform that the government is, I guess, setting up. Well, Koi Banks is setting it up, but it'll be a platform whereby people can upload their intellectual property and then be able to be in a Web3 kind of way, be able to be paid or to sell their patents or their copyrights or whatever. And the idea there is to, again, and this is a very Web3 idea, that you will be able to capture the value that you create in a better way than you do in Web2. And I've listened to a number of your podcasts, as you know, and I think, one of the themes is this idea that you are, in a Web2 world, a small number of players, own everything, right? And the rest of us are just kind of renting their services and have no skin in the game and no stake and no way to. And Web3 is meant to, turn that on its head. And so this is a very good example of, and getting to a much more kind of a Pareto best outcome, because those creators, hypothetical creators that didn't think that they were going to be able to make money from their creations, wouldn't bother to do it in the first place. You end up in a second best world, right? And now you can imagine much more of, if you think about sovereign wealth, you also think about human capital wealth of a country, much more of that now can potentially come to the fore because you're making it very transparent and very easy for them to capture that wealth, right? Another kind of,
and it's also super smart for the Nigerian government, right? Because it's going to be on chain, and so they'll be able to tax it, right? And so it's a way to essentially embed talent within the country as well, as opposed to, someone using a system that's not tied to any, sovereign nation or is headquartered in a place where effectively you're moving capital between different wallets and, no taxes are ever paid. So I think it's smart for the Nigerian government as well.
Yeah, 100%. Another interesting project, a couple of, there's sort of 4 or 5 that I'll just ping through quickly because I know we're coming on the hour. Another project in Argentina is called AgroToken. And in AgroToken, you can take, wheat or soy or corn or whatever it is, and it's geolocated, and a token is issued on that basis that takes into account, the moisture level and the rainfall and the quality. And then the Argentinian government has recognized that as the only stable coin that it recognizes in the country, actually. And so AgroToken, you can now, farmers, how the rest of the story goes, right? They can sell those tokens and solve their liquidity issues up front, They can smart contract to, sell the goods using those tokens. There's a kind of, it gives liquidity to the system in a way that is another one of the value propositions of Web3, right? And, more straight.
Similar to plastics and also very similar to the work, that Jahid's doing with Cerulean as well. So I think overall, the work that you're doing is super interesting. I'm particularly interested to follow your progress, just given that you have this really kind of interesting public sector background, going into banking, now going into crypto, and working for this kind of decentralized platform while we're all still trying to figure out decentralization. So we definitely want to have you back on in a year. And, if things go well, we'll be able to celebrate your success. If things don't go well, we'll do a deep dive on why decentralization doesn't work. And we should all just go work for
the man,
the titans of industry, right?
I'm personally super interested to see what the foundation and the various entities in the Algorand system, how you folks end up building kind of a polycentric governance structure. So we definitely have to have you on. We're very interested in that.
Well, I will tell you, you invited me, 5 weeks ago. And so I have been listening to, and you don't have that many podcasts, right? You've got sort of 30 or 40 or 50 of these. So I have now listened to many of them. And I think it's a terrific podcast. I really do. I've learned a lot. I've not seen a podcast that is solely focused on these issues and that you approach them from a very macro and a very micro way at the same time. And I think you're doing a great service to the ecosystem. So thank you very much for doing this.
Awesome. Staci, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much.